The outcome of World War II is at stake. Over 400 American and Japanese warships do battle at Leyte Gulf.
It was the largest naval action in history.
Japan is counting on a secret weapon the Americans know almost nothing about, except her name, Musashi.
You'll find in the summer of 1944, the naval intelligence experts groping for an understanding of these huge ships.
At 72,000 tons, she's the largest battleship ever built.
She's not just 10% bigger than some of these other vessels, she's nearly double.
Bristling with anti-aircraft batteries and massive 18-inch guns.
You can't believe all the firepower that comes up at one time.
Her builders boast she's unsinkable. Yet, in her first major fight, this super battleship is sent crashing to the ocean floor. But mysteries have always surrounded Musashi. Now, Americans and Japanese researchers are joining forces to unlock her most stubborn secrets.
This front part is where flooding is taking place.
Why did an unsinkable giant go down so fast? Was it overwhelming American air power, or a fatal design flaw that sent nearly 1,000 Japanese sailors to their death?
Hundreds of people are crying for help in horrified voices as they were all sucked into the waves.
To unravel the mysteries of Musashi, the missing giant must first be found. In February 2011, a research vessel begins a 3-week expedition in the Sibuyan Sea of the Central Philippines.
You know, if this was anywhere else, you'd see the whole coastline would have been changed with buildings and high-rises and all sorts of things, and that's not the case here. So we know we're looking at basically what the pilots saw 70-odd years ago.
The expedition is the brainchild of the late Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft. The son of a World War II veteran, Allen committed significant resources to searching for the war's most iconic missing shipwrecks. Among them, the mysterious Musashi. Rob Kraft is in charge of conducting all subsea operations.
Musashi was the pride of the Japanese fleet. It was so important to the Japanese people that they didn't even inform the population that it had sunk.
Lots of people would like to find the Musashi. It's one of the great battleships. It's one of the truly remarkable ones that haven't been found.
David Mearns has made a career out of hunting for lost shipwrecks. After months spent combing through military archives in the US and Japan,
What it's showing you here.
he's identified the critical clues he hopes will lead them to Musashi.
That one.
One is visual. Aerial photographs taken by American pilots during their final devastating attack.
There's the plane coming in, lining up right there to attack Musashi. And this is the next frame in the sequence. We can no longer see the plane, but we see a torpedo hit.
Clearly recognizable in the background of these photographs is the outline of Sibuyan Island, a few miles to the south.
Outside this, sir.
Outside the blue circle.
Outside the blue.
Yeah, yeah.
But there are other clues that may narrow down the search even further.
And the most important one came from one of the destroyers, a Japanese destroyer that was ordered to stand by Musashi. Hiroshima actually took a position for Musashi sinking.
Using the position reported by the destroyer Kiyoshimo, Mearns and Kraft have determined a high-probability search area. The tool selected for the search is called a multi-beam echo sounder. It's a type of sonar that's mounted on the ship's hull. An array of downward-looking beams emitting sound waves sweeps across the seabed to create an image of a mile-wide swath.
We're over here on the western side of our box. We're running the first line to the east, and this happens to be line number 13. And each line should take about 4 hours.
And because we're looking for, in the terms of the depth of water, quite a small target, we're mapping the seabed in very, very high detail. So the byproduct of our search is a really detailed map of this particular part of the Philippines.
Even though Musashi is as big as a 75-story building, the battleship will only show up as a small speck on this vast and unexplored seafloor. There's no guarantee she can be found.
It all depends on her orientation on the bottom, if she's in one piece, two piece, three pieces. We should be able to detect that and see that in what they call the backscatter imagery. When you hit something hard, it shows up as a very, very dark object.
It takes 4 days to cover the high probability area. It yields an impressive picture of the seabed below, including a newly discovered seamount. But so far, there's no sign of Musashi.
So our highest probability to begin with was all on the basis of this Japanese destroyer, Kiyoshima, which gave a precise sinking position. It's now very clear that that position wasn't as accurate as I had hoped. And because of that, we're now having to expand the search.
Their focus shifts to the second, albeit less precise clue.
That's about.
The aerial photographs taken by the American planes attacking Musashi.
I mean, I think if we go down here, we're going to be able to get a better feel.
Yeah.
This cardboard box, which has the same field of view as the camera the airmen used, allows Mearns to get a close approximation of what they saw.
Musashi would be about 2 kilometers closer to the island from here when these photographs are taken, and she sinks 4 hours later.
With the evidence gleaned from the photos, they plot a new series of sonar runs.
That's what we've covered, that red line there.
Right.
Anywhere outside of that she could be.
I would almost bias it further to the west, because in that photograph, she's clearly heading westerly as opposed to north.
But the clock is ticking. The expedition only has 2 weeks left to find the mystery ship. Musashi was first conceived in the 1930s, a time when Japan's efforts to expand its territory and influence in Asia and the Pacific were increasingly blocked by its former ally, the United States.
Japanese national prestige had been dealt an insult by the Washington Naval Treaty. Just to put it in numbers, the treaty created circumstances where for every 100 United States warships that are built, the Japanese are permitted 60. It created a future in which the Japanese Imperial Navy was going to be numerically inferior to the United States Navy.
In response, a powerful faction begins advocating for a different strategy.
Japan at the time had neither the resources nor the budget to build a large number of battleships to fight against the U.S. So they decided to counter quantity with quality. That was the idea they came up with.
Quality meant constructing giant battleships that could overcome the enemy's larger numbers. The new battleship was called the Yamato class after its prototype. To win public support, this Navy handbook likens it to a powerful figure in a popular movie of the time. The Hollywood film about a giant ape creating mayhem in New York was a huge hit with Japanese audiences.
And so the comparison is not just a comparison evocative of power and strength. It's also kind of pointed squarely at New York City and therefore pointed directly at the Americans.
In March 1938, construction of Musashi began here at the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki. Incredibly, the giant gantry crane that built her is still in use today.
The Japanese virtually had to reinvent naval architecture and design of ships to be able to build such colossal vessels.
Work proceeded under a literal veil of secrecy.
When they were being built, they were actually built behind gigantic curtains that were raised up at the shipyards, and so even friendly people couldn't see what was going on behind there. So there was some attempt to keep it a secret.
A schoolgirl at the time, Ms. Matsura remembers what it was like.
I was told never to look in the direction of the shipyard, that soldiers are on board keeping watch. You must not look, or the soldiers will take you away. Even as a child, I kind of sensed that a big war was going to break out.
On December 7th, 1941, that war began. In its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy used carrier-based air power to devastating effect against the American fleet. Ironically, that success only reinforced its faith in its own new super battleships.
A lot of the naval theory at the time was based on this fleet-on-fleet engagement. The Japanese in particular were still hoping for that kind of thing. This is how you wrest sea control from the other guy. You defeat his fleet.
In August 1942, Musashi began secret sea trials. Weapons and defenses, carefully kept out of sight from enemy spies, were put to the test.
Musashi's main armament came in the form of 3 turrets mounting 3 Type 94 naval guns. These were of 18-inch caliber and were therefore the largest naval guns in use anywhere in the world.
To defend herself, Musashi was shielded by the heaviest armor ever used on a ship's hull. The high-grade steel came from low-phosphorus iron secretly mined in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. For 19-year-old Masahiro Oishi and the hundreds of young sailors assigned to serve aboard this giant, Musashi was a technological wonder.
We never thought for a second that Musashi would sink and people would die. We believed that such a giant ship could not be taken down.
To them, she was the King Kong of the sea. Day 14 of the Musashi search expedition.
In this direction here.
At last, the team thinks they're onto something.
Could she be broken in 4 pieces sitting there?
One of their sonar runs has revealed a promising target.
That is exactly what you want to look for. Bow, superstructure, things falling off the superstructure, blah, blah, blah. Central area, engine room, brake here, explosion there, stern. It's all going to be right there. And if it capsized, it's going to be over.
But after making several more sonar runs, they reluctantly reach the conclusion the object is too large.
You know, it's 100 meters bigger than what we're looking for. Wow. So it's 30% bigger.
I think it's definitely something.
Yeah.
Other than geology. But I don't think it's Musashi.
After 3 weeks, the expedition is out of time. The research vessel must return to port. But they've covered a staggering 1,400 square miles, an area as big as the state of Rhode Island.
What we now have is a very highly accurate map of the entire area that we want to search. We know where she's not. We've ruled out large swathes of the Sibuyan Sea.
And their commitment to the task has only intensified.
Everybody's kind of got a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in trying to find this wreck. You know, you get this personal passion going trying to find this thing.
But to succeed, they must first find a better tool for searching the rugged seafloor below. By the time Musashi joined the Japanese war effort in the Pacific in 1942, the momentum was about to shift.
The Japanese actually are prevailing at this point because they're better at surface warfare than we are at this early stage in the game. What then becomes clear is that anytime aircraft carriers get involved, the whole thing changes.
The U.S. embraces naval air power in a way that it just hadn't before. It revises the way that it trains, it revises tactics, and it revises weapons to the extent that it introduces a new fighter, a new dive bomber, a new torpedo bomber, and it even introduces a new torpedo.
The Mark 13 torpedo was more reliable and could be dropped at higher altitude than its predecessor. At the same time, American intelligence secured a valuable lead.
On the island of Tulagi, Americans captured a document that was a warship recognition manual that was to be used by Imperial Navy sailors to recognize their own ships. And it had a drawing of a Yamato-class ship.
But after that, nothing. It's as if Japan's most secret weapon had vanished.
You'll find in the summer of 1944, the naval intelligence experts groping for an understanding of these huge ships. And they came up with estimates that were just unbelievable.
But as they would later discover, even those estimates were way too small. By June 1944, American forces succeeded in pushing the Japanese fleet, totaling some 60 ships and 450 aircraft, out of the Western Pacific. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.
They call it that because they harvest so many Japanese aircraft. They shoot them down wholesale. The Japanese lose half their carrier strength, and they lose almost all of their naval aviation.
American General Douglas MacArthur was now poised to invade the gateway to Japan itself, the Philippines. On October 20th, MacArthur came ashore on the eastern side of Leyte Island, where American troops encountered little resistance.
The opinion united of American intelligence agencies was that the Japanese Navy would not come out. We based our ideas on the assumption that the Japanese would need a considerable amount of time to train new aircrew and pilots for their aircraft carrier groups.
But American intelligence was ignoring one critical fact. Japan's Navy remained committed to fighting a decisive battle at sea. Its surface fleet was still largely intact, led by two giants Americans had yet to lay eyes on, Musashi and Yamato.
American radio intelligence had knowledge of the movements of these Japanese ships, but still not of their characteristics.
On October 24th, 1944, Admiral Kurita's center force with 26 ships entered the Sibuyan Sea. Two other slightly smaller Japanese fleets approached from the south and north. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was about to begin.
In the morning, when Kurita is crossing the Sibuyan Sea, the reconnaissance flights pick this up. And of course, at that point, they're aware they got two very large battleships down here.
American pilots were the first to catch a real glimpse of Musashi and Yamato.
We knew that they had two big battleships. That's about all we knew. And it was obviously the biggest thing we'd ever seen.
Although caught by surprise, the U.S. Navy was prepared. 7th Fleet moved to guard the Leyte landing site itself, while 3rd Fleet deployed in 3 groups to the north.
Unfortunately, the one element of the 3rd Fleet that's closest to San Bernardino Strait is a little bit weaker because it sent one of its carriers off to refuel.
Its sole remaining large carrier was only half the size of the two giants bearing down on it, with 24 more warships in Japan's center force. In late February 2015, Rob Kraft and David Mearns renew their search for Musashi. Since they were last here, they've found the perfect tool for the difficult task ahead. It's now installed aboard the expedition yacht Octopus, equipped with state-of-the-art deep-sea equipment. Their key search tool is still so new, it's rarely been used in the deep ocean.
AUV is an autonomous underwater vehicle. Our AUV is capable of diving down to 1,500 meters. It takes with it a side-scan sonar system that looks out on the sides and provides us an image of things that may be lying on the seafloor.
Its survey route is selected based on the bathymetric map that systems engineer Wayne Sadowski compiled during the 2011 expedition.
This map is of basically the subsea volcano that we're seeing. And so using this map, we then program the autonomous vehicle.
Traveling 2/3 of a mile down and a few hundred feet above the ocean floor, the AUV maps the terrain. But distinguishing a man-made object among the rugged volcanic outcrops is challenging.
Because the lava rock is as reflective as the acoustic waves are that we use to bounce off the metal of the Musashi.
After 18 hours, the AUV returns to the surface and is brought on board to download the data.
Everybody had a go at looking at the side-scan information. Everybody, what do you see? Oh, it's something shiny there. That's a rock. No, that's a rock. No, that's something. No, that's a rock.
The first AUV survey yields nothing, as does the second.
And I'll tell you that up to that point, we were starting to second-guess ourselves. We had searched a large portion of the primary search area, and we weren't finding what we had hoped to find.
On the third run, they finally see something.
Generally, when you're finding a wreck, it's either happening instantaneously, but in this one, it was a bit of a slow burner because the sonar image didn't sort of shout out, this is Musashi, this is where I sank. It was more of, there was an indication something was there.
Dave, you're fully in the water. That's a safe heading.
For a closer look, they launch a remotely operated vehicle, or ROV.
It's smaller than a Volkswagen Bug, but it's still quite substantial. And it's on a cable as well. But in that cable, it has power conductors and fiber, and through that, we get to watch our HD camera that's on the end of the tether.
It will take the ROV an hour to reach the ocean floor, almost a mile below. Plenty of time to wonder if at last, they're going to set eyes on Musashi. On the morning of October 24th, 1944, the skies over the Sibuyan Sea were filled with over 40 American warplanes.
The U.S. naval aircraft that oppose the Japanese center force in the Sibuyan Sea consists of the Hellcat fighter, the Helldiver dive bomber, and the Avenger torpedo bomber.
The fighters led the way with strafing runs.
You're going to go after the battleships because they are the biggest target. They can do the most damage to you, therefore you want to take them out.
But the Japanese gunners were ready. Unleashing a hail of fire from Musashi's 100 anti-aircraft guns.
Aerial attacks had become fierce after war broke out. So the decision was made to strengthen anti-aircraft defenses, and machine guns were also rapidly added. But there was no industrial capacity to manufacture bulletproof armor at this point.
With little to protect them, some of the gun crews suffered heavy casualties.
Everything was blown to bits. There were pieces of machine gun everywhere, with human flesh stuck to them. I could not believe they were parts of human beings.
Bob Freely was a 22-year-old pilot flying an Avenger torpedo bomber that day.
The sky is so big up there, I don't see all the fighters. I don't have time to look around to see anybody else because everything happens like that.
What he did see was a giant battleship below.
The Musashi has 11 planes coming in on it. You're coming down, then you start leveling off. And all this time they're shooting at you, and you don't know whether this bullet's going to hit you or... So you get about the distance that you think you should be at the altitude you should be, open your bomb bay doors, and you're all set, boom.
His rear gunner watched as their 2,000-pound torpedo slammed into Musashi's port side.
The torpedo bomber is the most effective weapon against a battleship because it can release something that carries a great deal of punch. The American Mark 13 torpedo carried a warhead of 600 pounds of high explosive. That was enough force to punch through an armor belt.
Musashi withstood the initial American assault, but the attacks kept coming.
The fleets that are there at Leyte consist of multiple aircraft carriers. It's mind-boggling by today's standards how many ships were there. And so as a result of that, they could continue to attack, and wave after wave coming in.
During the last wave, an American pilot took his memorable series of photographs. The relentless onslaught began to take a toll.
When the Musashi loses speed and falls behind, then it's obvious that she's damaged. So now's the moment to close in for the kill.
Lionel Gilbo was the rear gunner in the Helldiver bomber.
A pilot dive bombed the battleship with a 2,000-pound armor-piercing bomb right down the stack.
These particular ships, very formidable ships, but they also made very large targets that were easily identified. And I think that's one of the reasons a lot of the aviators concentrated on Musashi, and she paid the price as a result.
Yamato escaped the onslaught, but at 7:39 p.m., 4 hours after the final attack, Musashi, crippled yet miraculously still in one piece, rolled over and sank.
Hundreds of people are crying for help in horrified voices as they were all sucked into the waves.
In the pitch darkness of the deep sea, the ROV pilot carefully maneuvers his vehicle.
We came across some very small pieces of debris, which looked the right age, looked the right material, but we weren't quite certain.
Everybody was pretty much running on adrenaline at that time. It was very exciting.
The ROV moves slowly through this unfamiliar landscape.
It took about, I guess, a half hour or 45 minutes before we started getting into the heavier debris, and then it became more and more obvious.
And you see them, right? There's 3 characters over there, I think.
That's Japanese. It's a Japanese warship.
The minute we found the valve that had the kanji writing on it, just like, okay, this is Japanese. Now all we have to do is prove that it's the Musashi.
To do that, they need to find the ship's bow.
There's the bullets, 2 bullets. We're not too far away. It'll be above the gasket cable. Something's there. It's there.
The gold paint is gone, but the outline of the Imperial Japanese flower emblem is still there.
As soon as we found the chrysanthemum on the bow, we knew what we were looking at.
That's proof positive. There wasn't the kind of, jumping up and shouting for joy that I've experienced in the past. It was sort of a quiet relief that we had finally done it.
At long last, Musashi is found, but a new and still more intriguing mystery is about to emerge. Over the next week, the search team explores the wreck of the super battleship.
Some shelves on the top.
I think there's another one of the mounts for a light or a...
70 years after she disappeared, they're compiling the first detailed picture of a lost technological marvel.
Because there are no drawings for this ship, and there's only a handful of photographs, so we're the first people really to document what she looks like.
They also find signs of those who sailed her. A shoe, a helmet, and something unexpected on a warship.
What? That's film. That is a film strip.
It's not just a metal ship. These are crew that served in it, and some obviously died on the site as well, so it's important to document that.
Musashi lies a good distance from the sinking position reported by the destroyer Kiyoshima. But that's not the only reason she was so hard to find.
The Musashi is literally on the side of a volcano. And if you've hiked up a volcano before, you know there's great big huge rocks and outcroppings and boulders. And so it's hidden inside the geology.
The difficulty in finding the wreck is also explained by her shocking condition.
Just the complete and utter destruction of the ship itself. The stern and the bow sections are really the only whole parts of the hull that remain. The bridge is somewhat intact from what we can see, but the rest, the center section of the ship was just completely destroyed.
So essentially, it's broken its back in at least 2 different locations. And for a ship that withstood so many attacks from torpedoes and bombs and essentially sank intact, that's more than I expected.
What then could have caused such widespread destruction? It's a question which so far has no answer. One of the last pieces to be discovered is Musashi's most potent weapon.
Which is obviously what caught everybody's imagination, these special 18-inch guns. These guns are held into the body of the ship, into the barbettes, by gravity alone. So when the ship capsizes, they're incredibly heavy objects that just fall out to their own weight. We found one of these guns after a week of searching.
By now, the expedition has assembled an extensive record of Musashi. Over 100 hours of video footage alone.
We want to make sure that we've fully documented the condition and the state of the wreck so we can share that with everybody. And, what we've done here and the data that we've gathered will provide the clues that people can use to recreate or have an understanding of what actually happened.
The search team has opened a door. Now, others must step in to unravel Musashi's final hours. In March 2016, a group of Japanese experts assembles in Tokyo to take up the challenge. To help them, the Japanese broadcaster NHK has created a valuable tool. Like pieces of a gigantic puzzle, it's taken the hours of digital images gathered by the search expedition, painstakingly piecing them back together, and creating a unique 3D model of the wreck. Only now is Musashi's enormous size apparent. At 263 meters, some 900 feet, she's longer than 3 jumbo jets. To begin with, These experts want to find out why a ship so many believed unsinkable should fail its first serious test.
What is that thing that looks like a hole?
Masami Tezuka has been studying the Musashi for 30 years. He believes he's identified one clue: a damaged section protruding from the port bow, most likely caused by a torpedo strike.
Musashi would lose speed as a result, making it difficult to steer her. From an attacker's point of view, a battleship that's dragging would have been easier to hit with bombs or torpedoes.
The last photo of Musashi shows her down at the bow, leading to the belief that flooding here caused her to sink. But a new scientific investigation at the University of Kobe tells a different story. Professor Hirotada Hashimoto, a specialist in naval architecture, conducted the analysis. When he simulates flooding inside the bow, the ship does pitch forward. But results show watertight compartments in the rest of the ship would not have been affected.
Even if the bow, including the part protected by armor plating, is completely filled with water, the ship will still be left with enough buoyancy. So this flooding alone definitely could not have caused the ship to sink or capsize.
To find answers to why Musashi sank, these experts will have to look elsewhere, starting in the place where Musashi was constructed. At the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki, the Japanese team makes an important discovery. A file marked Musashi is uncovered in the company archives. It contains more than 200 pages of never-before-released original blueprints. By comparing images of the scattered pieces of the wreck with the blueprint, the team is able to identify them. A pump, a boiler, all parts protected by the heavy steel armor intended to make Musashi unsinkable.
So the biggest question is, where did the armor go?
In the high-resolution sonar image of the debris field, one structure attracts their attention. Examining video footage from the area, they discover a 90-foot piece of steel. It looks like part of the missing armor. When they match it up to the 3D model, they find it comes from the hull on the port side. But how did it come loose?
Musashi's armor belt was so thick that everyone felt very confident on board the ship that they could stand up to the punishment of any weapon that could be thrown at it. But whereas ships making use of thinner plate could be welded, Musashi's armor could not be welded. It was simply too thick. And so they turned back to the 19th century and simply hot riveted the plates together.
A company that took part in riveting the armor for Musashi is still operating in Osaka. Two workers recreate the technique used at the time to join these two pieces of armor plate. A special hammer drives the rivet into place.
Japanese sailors assigned to Musashi had great confidence in the ship. They thought it was unsinkable, and that's because above deck they saw nothing but guns and firepower. But then below deck, they were aware that the ship had the thickest armor of any warship in the world.
But the Japanese investigation team doesn't share the sailors' confidence.
I think rivets were the problem. No matter how thick the armor plates were, they wouldn't last once the rivets came loose.
Musashi's armor was attached at a slanting angle to deflect incoming shells.
She was built to withstand artillery duels against other battleships. But instead, she was hit by torpedoes and aerial bombs, which weren't weapons she expected to face when she was designed.
If a torpedo from an attacking aircraft struck a joint in the armor plate, it could cause rivets to fail and seawater to begin to seep in. So how did this apparent vulnerability to torpedo strikes go unnoticed? The team discovers early concerns about this possible design flaw. A former officer on Musashi, who earlier served on her sister ship Yamato, made this recording before he died.
I heard from Yamato's crew that during a torpedo attack, although the armor remained intact, the rivets were blown off, and gradually, water started to leak in around the joints. It made me realize if we were hit by a lot of torpedoes, there would be more flooding, and that could be her weakest point.
Shigeru Makino, a naval designer who oversaw the construction of Musashi, reported similar misgivings. But later wrote, the naval authorities decided to simply patch the armor joint rather than find a permanent solution to the problem. In the minds of Musashi's 2,400 crewmen, many still in their teens or early 20s, the Imperial Japanese Navy instilled a beguiling illusion. Their super battleship was quite simply unsinkable. One of them, Masahiro Oishi, believed it to the very end.
Right up till the moment it sank, I didn't think it could happen. The Musashi wouldn't even budge an inch with a torpedo or two striking her. There would be no flooding, so we were told.
Musashi also proved vulnerable to another unanticipated weapon: armor-piercing bombs from the air. As the search team discovered.
Now once you get in there a little tighter.
Underwater footage revealed one of several 3-foot holes rupturing the ship's deck.
In a short section of the bow, we saw the damage from the bombs. That's corroborating what the U.S. pilots were telling us about the hits they were getting on Musashi.
These weapons, although they are as crude and as simple as they can be, send through the air column, penetrate decks, and can explode below deck. This, in the end, causes great destruction on Musashi.
Now, thanks to the 3D model of the wreck, the full extent of that destruction can be seen, especially up on the bridge, where the captain and many of his officers were stationed. A gaping 20-foot hole gouged into the starboard side marks where a bomb struck. One crew member up here miraculously survived. Kenji Atsuka remembers what happened.
All the desks, chairs, everything flew to the port side. Bodies of those who were killed were piled up there too. The blast wave knocked us over, killing some. One man lost everything from his neck up, sitting in a chair about 10 feet from where I was. Just dead.
Standing on an open observation deck, Captain Inoguchi suffered a shrapnel wound in the shoulder. Protected from the fire himself, crewman Kotaki observed what happened.
I saw him from behind. He was covering his shoulder with his hand, like this, holding binoculars, like this, and giving commands. Any ordinary person would have collapsed from such injuries. I thought, that's a true commander.
Like her brave captain, Musashi sustained multiple hits from weapons she was never designed to face. Incredibly, her unusual strength allowed her to go down in one piece, leaving one final question. What tore her to pieces as she sank?
That's a 46-centimeter shell underneath there, right?
When the search team originally discovered Musashi,
The turret housing was blown away.
They couldn't believe the wreckage was spread over such a wide area. A square kilometer, more than half a square mile.
Most of the shipwrecks that I've done are in deeper water than this, and we're seeing debris fields of 300 meters, 400 meters. So to see one twice or three times that size is really telling me that not only are we dealing with a large ship, but a large ship that has been blown apart.
How does a ship that left the surface intact now lie shattered over the ocean floor? The Japanese team is determined to find an answer to this final mystery of Musashi.
I'm not sure if it came from a boiler or something else, but is it possible this damage was caused by steam exploding?
One member doesn't think so. Masatake Yoshida has been studying explosives for over 30 years. He believes something else tore Musashi apart.
I can't think of any explanation besides a gunpowder explosion. If an explosion like that occurred, her internal parts would have shattered into many pieces.
But where did this massive explosion take place? One piece of debris in particular has caught Yoshida's attention. Although mangled almost beyond recognition, it's part of the magazine, holding the shells for one of Musashi's main guns.
Thick steel like this wouldn't have ended up being so badly twisted if the ship had just sunk.
Since Musashi fired her main guns only a handful of times during her final battle, an estimated 160 shells and 100 tons of gunpowder were still stored inside her. Suspicion as to where the explosion occurred falls on the second main gun.
That was literally...
And first-hand reports David Mearns uncovered seem to support it.
To see that level of damage on the seafloor tells me only one thing, that the Japanese survivors who heard explosions as it was capsizing, those explosions were actually magazine explosions.
In the final moments, as Musashi heeled over and sank, a few eyewitnesses aboard a nearby destroyer reported seeing the flash from a small explosion.
Which means that some fires were already burning inside her. That makes me think that initial combustion rapidly spread into an explosion. Gunpowder contains some oxygen, so even underwater where there's none, under the right conditions, a combustive explosion can occur.
To test his hypothesis, Dr. Yoshida ran a computer simulation. It clearly shows a ship made of heavy steel would have suffered catastrophic damage from an explosion below her second main gun. The ship's core would have splintered into hundreds of small pieces, with only the bow and stern remaining relatively intact. The high-resolution sonar map confirms this is how the wreck rests on the seafloor. David Mearns believes other factors also contributed to the massive damage sustained by Musashi.
You see that a large section of the bow was imploded, and we can look at the drawings and know that there's watertight compartments in there, and they've squeezed as the ship sank very quickly.
As Musashi plummets to the bottom, a crushing pressure equivalent to the weight of a car bears down on every square inch.
When it hits the seabed, it's hitting the seabed actually at very high speed, probably minimum of 15 knots, maybe as much as 25 knots, and there's impact damage. And all of this was evident in one section of the bow.
Somewhere in Musashi's twisted remains lies her captain, Toshihira Inoguchi. He went down with his ship after handing over his final report. In it, he wrote,
I am truly glad that the other battleships suffered almost no damage. And I feel some consolation in thinking that Musashi was able to assume the role of a victim.
Musashi bore the brunt of the American air assault on October 24, 1944, leaving most of Japan's center force unscathed, including the super battleship Yamato. Undetected, Admiral Kurita and his 20 remaining ships steamed through the night, heading for the American landing site at Leyte to catch the defending force from 7th Fleet by surprise. On October 25th, led by the super battleship Yamato, the Japanese Navy launched the decisive surface attack it had long sought. But a bold strike by American destroyers and destroyer escorts managed to confuse the Japanese commander.
And so Admiral Kurita makes the fateful decision to reverse course, and in so doing, he walks away from what would have been the most lopsided victory of the Japanese Imperial Navy in the Second World War.
Japan's Navy had gambled on winning the world's biggest sea battle to bring America to the negotiating table. But they made a fatal miscalculation. Surface ships with big guns were no longer the dominant force at sea.
In the age of the battleships, the building and the loss of the Musashi is the end point. They weren't going to be defeated by another battleship, another great battleship, but by aircraft. And that's when the era of aircraft carriers took off.
On October 24th, 2016, at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, surviving crew members from Musashi gather to remember their lost comrades. The discovery of the wreck and the evidence it reveals of Musashi's vulnerability is a cruel reminder. This was not the unsinkable battleship they were led to believe her to be. But for crewman Sakuda, the wreck still bears an important message.
I think the Musashi would like the people to know how bravely her crew members fought and died, what an astonishing battleship she was, how she fought and met her tragic end in the emptiness of war. I think those are the messages that the Musashi wants to send us.
For Bob Freely, an American pilot who launched one of the many torpedoes that sank her, Musashi's discovery stirs thoughts of reconciliation.
I don't want any Japanese survivor to think that I'm trying to laud these medals over them. Our opportunity is we have a common ground. They are survivors of the same action that I am a survivor of. And I'd just like to say, welcome, brother.
Going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
Above the wreck site in the Sibuyan Sea, the crew of the Octopus pay their own final respects.
It is a war grave. You know, we as sailors and seafarers ourselves, we have a lot of respect for what happened here.
Instead of warplanes, they launch a flight of paper cranes. Symbol of the peace that has endured for 3/4 of a century between once bitter enemies of World War II.